Hello. Today I'm going to be reviewing the first season of The Bad Batch. It's an animated Star Wars show that follows on after the events of the Clone Wars and follows the titular group of clones, the Bad Batch, who were introduced in Season 7 of the Clone Wars. They're an elite group of clones with mutations. There's Hunter, who has enhanced senses, Wrecker, who's incredibly strong, Tech, who's incredibly smart, and Crosshair, who is a master marksman. And we also have Echo, who ended up joining the Bad Batch during the Clone Wars Season 7. Now, I don't want to go into too many specifics about what happens in each episode, but I do want to talk about the first episode, which kind of sets up the show as a whole. Now, the episode starts off with the Bad Batch on this planet. They help out a battalion of clones and their Jedi by defeating a bunch of Separatist droids. They're about to head off to continue to fight the Separatists when Order 66 comes through. Now, the regular clones go through with it and end up killing the Jedi Master. But the Bad Batch, interestingly enough, don't fully fall under its effects. They seem confused by the whole situation and are unsure of what's happening. However, when the Padawan flees, Hunter and Crosshair chase after him. However, the pair of them disagree on what should be done. Hunter seeks to protect the child and he wants to find out what exactly this Order 66 is first before he does anything drastic. Crosshair, on the other hand, wants to kill the Jedi, saying that good soldiers follow orders. After a brief chase, the Padawan ends up escaping, and the Bad Batch return to Kamino. This is where they learn that the Republic has been dissolved and is now being reorganized into the First Galactic Empire, and they find out more information about Order 66. Now, eventually Tarkin comes in, and he wants to see if the clones are going to be useful to the Empire still. He takes notice of the Bad Batch and has them complete a test, and he puts them through a training battle, which they handle pretty well. Afterwards, he deploys the Bad Batch to eliminate some Separatists on Onderon. So the Bad Batch head there, expecting to find droids, but what they actually find are people, some of which are even civilians. And among them is Saw Gerrera, who you may remember from Season 5 of the Clone Wars. Or you might remember him from Rebels. Or you might remember him from Rogue One. Hunter has no desire to go through this mission, but Crosshair urges that they should. So there's a bit more arguing between the two, but they eventually leave and return to Kamino. Now, thanks to a probe droid that Tarkin sent, he knows that the Bad Batch didn't go through with the mission, and so he arrests them for treason. Now, Tarkin's taken note of Crosshair, seeming to be loyal to the Empire. And so he takes him out to the lab and they scan him, and it's discovered that his chip is active and Order 66 has been triggered. It's just that the chip is not operating at full capacity, so it's having a minimal effect. So Tarkin has them turn the chip up. While he's doing this, however, the rest of the Bad Batch end up escaping, and they make their way to the hangar to get their stuff, which is where they get accosted by a bunch of clones led by Crosshair himself, who is working for the Empire now. There's a bit of a standoff, but then eventually the Bad Batch barely manage to escape. During this time, they also encounter Omega, who's a young girl who's also a clone, and they end up taking her with them. And she actually plays a major part in helping them to escape. So that's the general setup of the show. The Bad Batch are on the run, and Crosshair is working for the Empire. Now, as I said, I don't really want to go into each episode in particular. Some of them are quite good, some of them are alright, some of them are really outstanding. But in general, the show sort of follows the Bad Batch as they struggle to sort of adapt to the new situation. They're on the run and they need to fend for themselves now. Now, throughout the series, there are a few different plot points that come into play in different episodes. One of the main things in this show that I think was done really well is the dynamic between Hunter and Omega, and to a lesser extent the rest of the Bad Batch and Omega. Hunter and Omega sort of have that parent-child dynamic, which is completely new territory for Hunter. He's never had a kid before. He's never had to be a parent before. So it's interesting to see him sort of have to navigate that. And yeah, to a lesser extent, there's also a similar dynamic with the rest of the Bad Batch. But it's predominantly Hunter and Omega. But it's also really handled really well because Omega is actually quite a capable character, and she manages to help the Bad Batch out, in many situations, becoming a crucial part of their team, which I quite like. She doesn't just fall into that category of a helpless child. She's actually a crucial member of the team, without which the Bad Batch would have probably lost 10 times over. Now, as well as this dynamic, there's also the dynamic between the Bad Batch and Crosshair. It's mostly Hunter and Crosshair, but there is a little bit of dynamic with some of the other members of the Bad Batch. The first episode really does a good job of highlighting Hunter and Crosshair's differences. Hunter seems to care more about what his orders are, and he sort of questions them when they don't seem right. Crosshair, on the other hand, he doesn't care. He doesn't give two shits about if what he's doing is right or wrong. To him, orders are orders. But despite this fact, he was still a member of the Bad Batch, and both the Bad Batch and Crosshair seem to sort of miss each other, even if they're on opposing sides. They still care about each other and are hurt that the others have betrayed them. And it's a dynamic that's explored really well in the few episodes that Crosshair actually appears and interacts with them. As a whole, however, Crosshair doesn't appear in the show quite as often as the others. Now, there's a couple other things that the show shows us really well. It takes place in that sort of transitional period when the Republic is becoming the Empire, which is a really fascinating time to show. So we get to see things like the Empire implementing their chain code thing, and we get to see the Empire slowly beginning to phase out clone troopers in favour of volunteers and conscripts. Much later in the season, we actually get to see the Empire implementing what are called TK troopers, which are like a very early version of stormtroopers. Their armour is somewhat between a stormtrooper and a clone trooper. And it's cool because we actually get to see clones and some of the clone vehicles working for the Empire, which is something that is really cool to see and also very odd. Like, there's this one episode where they have ATTEs. There's a really interesting sort of subplot with the Kaminoans. There's an interesting dynamic with the Empire clearly having less need and less interest for clone troopers. So we have lots of scenes where we have Tarkin or Admiral Rampart talking with the Kaminoans about getting volunteers and conscripts instead of clones. And the Kaminoans, of course, are trying to convince them not to give up on the clones. And once the Bad Batch escape, the Kaminoans sort of have their own sort of agenda because they want to capture the Bad Batch so they can use them as a base for a new breed of clones, which will be much better than the first ones, they reckon. Whereas the Empire simply just wants to kill them because they're traitors. They don't have any use for them. Now, this whole subplot, it wasn't given as much screen time as some of the other things, but it was quite interesting. And it was cool to see how the Kaminoans reacted to the Republic becoming the Empire. Now, one area where I thought the show could have improved was developing some of the Bad Batch characters a bit more. Now, Hunter and Crosshair and Omega are all done really well. There's interesting dynamics between Hunter and Omega. There's interesting dynamics between Crosshair and the Bad Batch, specifically Hunter. So overall, there's a lot of good stuff with them. However, when it comes to Wrecker, Echo, and Tech, I feel like they were perhaps underutilized a bit. I feel like if each of these characters had had maybe a little bit of time to develop them a bit, it would have been good. Now, Echo does have some good moments, and he does have an episode where he sort of has a bit of an arc about learning to move on from the whole Republic versus Separatist thing, which was quite good. But it would have been nice to see a bit more from him and from Wrecker and Tech as well. Now, another area where I thought the show fell a little flat was with the overuse of pre-existing characters. Almost all of the episodes feature some kind of pre-existing character, whether they be from the Clone Wars, from Rebels, or another show. And I'm not talking about just cameos, like they have actual important roles in the episodes. Now, I don't have an issue with using pre-existing characters, and in a lot of cases, they made sense. I just feel like it happens too often. It sort of feels like they're like, oh, look, it's this character. Oh, look, it's this character. You know that character? They're from this other show. Now, I don't want to be too harsh on it because it's not a big deal overall, and in a lot of cases, I think it was justified. For example, the second episode features Cutler Quain, who was the clone deserter in that season 2 episode of the Clone Wars. Out of context, he sounds like a random character to insert into this show. But given that he's a father and a family man, he does sort of make sense because he sort of highlights that dynamic that Hunter and Omega at this point hadn't really developed properly. So he did play into that whole dynamic in a good way. Rex is another character who makes a lot of sense to have in the show. Now, Rex has had personal dealings with Order 66, and he's one of the few clones who's actually removed his inhibitor chip. So he makes perfect sense as a character to bring in, because he needs someone to warn the Bad Batch about the inhibitor chips and how dangerous they are. So they're characters that really make sense to include. Then you have some characters who you could technically use other people, but they sort of make sense, and it's harmless enough. For example, Caleb Doom's cameo. You could have used any Jedi and Padawan you wanted, really, and it would have had the same effect. But I guess it's harmless enough having a cameo there. However, I feel like a few of the other characters that were put in seemed to only be included because they wanted to use pre-existing characters, like Bib Fortuna. That was just sort of random. And the Martyr sisters, like, I don't think having them in the show really added anything. So it's a mixed bag. There are some that work, some that are okay, and some that I feel were not that important to include. As a whole, I don't think it's a major issue. It's just a little distracting when it happens almost every episode. So, that about wraps up my review. To give my final thoughts, I think this show is really, really good. It's a nice follow-on from the Clone Wars. However, it is structured more like Rebels, where you have a crew of characters going on various missions, which I think works really well. It allows you to have more time with these characters in particular and develop their dynamics. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, I feel like Wrecker, Tech, and Echo could have done with a bit more development. But Hunter, Omega, and Crosshair are all pretty well done and have a lot of interesting stories about them. So I would highly recommend The Bad Batch Season 1, and I eagerly await the second season, which should be coming out January next year, as long as they don't delay it again. And this will actually wrap up my videos for this year. My next video won't be out till January, so I hope you all have a happy holiday and a happy new year, and I will see you guys in 2023. Goodbye.